Thank you, Alex, and thank you, everyone. So today we have our grant and partnership leads for Unit Masters, who is Alexandros, and he's a marketing manager of Blockchain Netherlands Foundation, and he holds a bachelor's in international business management, and is currently also pursuing a master's in blockchain and digital currency. Alex holds the Chartered Blockchain Expert certificate, and his professional background is in PRO marketing, event organization, and open public blockchains. Alexandros fell in love with cryptocurrency because he values individualism, freedom, financial inclusivity, and censorship resistance, apolitical money, as he believes that a handful of politicians, no matter the country, cannot represent and decide for whole nations of millions of people. He hopes by using this technology, he can help build a better financial world than the one we currently live in. Really interesting bio. And Alex, thanks for joining us again today. And once you're ready, please take it away.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Agama, for the wonderful introduction.
Your mic is muted.
Tell me, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, Rahul can hear me and Paula as well. So everyone can hear me, I suppose, at least. Okay, great, wonderful. So hello, everyone. First of all, Agama, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. And as Agama said, today we're going to talk a little bit more, let's say, in a more, let's say, on ground or more practical way of doing, let's say, with the metaverse and everything. So how I kind of saw it is I would give a few definitions. I would give my own definition of what the metaverse is. I would give a few, let's say, use cases of it. And I would talk a little bit about what is a centralized closed metaverse, let's say, what is an open decentralized metaverse. And then hopefully this is the first time that I'm actually going to do this, is we're all going to try and visit the OM open metaverse and see how it works. Let's hope it works fine for everyone. Yeah, let's start from the very beginning. So I have prepared a small, short presentation. So how we're going to do this is I'm going to do this small presentation. At the end of the presentation, I have a few links where we're going to explore the OM metaverse. It's not going to be too long, maybe. It's just for you to have maybe the links afterwards and you can explore it yourself. We're not sponsored in any way by the OM metaverse. This is just for learning, experience, for learning purposes. And because it is a really nice created metaverse where people can access it no matter the speed, let's say, of their internet, I think this would be the best. It would be the best fit to try and do something like this, because depending on how quick your internet is, automatically the metaverse manages to let's say adjust your graphics so that you can basically be in the metaverse itself, right? So let's start. As I said, there are a few definitions of the metaverse, right? And I gave 3 here. All 3 of them are completely different viewpoint. So one of them is more, let's say, a more general, a more aspiring one, which is that a metaverse is a seamless convergence of our physical and digital lives. So this is by JP Morgan. You probably know the huge investment bank. And what this basically means is that from the metaverse perspective, we would not be able to distinguish between our physical lives and our digital lives in some ways. We will see in some ways how this will play out, of course. Then there is the more technical definition that a metaverse is a real-time 3D social medium where people can create their own experiences and participate as equals in an economy with societal impact. This is a bit more technical, as you kind of see. And then the more conceptual, let's say, is from Don Radoff, which says that the metaverse is not either 3D or 2D or even necessarily graphical. It's about the unavoidable dematerialization of physical space, distance, and objects. So basically creating, let's say from the physical and real space, let's say the analog world, you kind of create a digital one instead. These are, let's say, 3 different ways of seeing it. And in the next slide, I have included my own version, let's say, of the metaverse and how I would define it. So this is a metaverse is the internet going from websites to a 3D visual world, where people can have experiences together. They can own their digital items. This can be a land. This can be like creating your own economy, building your own house, hiring architects to build your house, let's say, however you basically would like that to be done, and more, of course, right? So an example of that would be that, in Web 2, if I want to go on Amazon now, I go on Amazon.com, right? And I buy, let's say, if I want to buy a new phone, a new iPhone, I go on Amazon.com, I type iPhone, the latest one. I don't know which one is the latest one, and I go there, click on add to cart, and I pay for it, and it comes to my house after a few days, 1 day or a few days, depending on where you are, right, in the world. In the metaverse, what would happen is that instead of having a website, I would go to a 3D world where Amazon has a store, and I would be able to be there, not maybe physically with my physical body, but I could create an avatar that would represent me, and I could go to that store and buy whatever I would like to buy and experience other stuff, right? So that would be, let's say, more like going to a physical store in a digital kind of way, right? And I also mentioned that people would be able to own certain items, these digital items. Some of these items include, avatars, metaverse spaces, as I said, land, houses. You would be able to create your own businesses. Let's say we also learned about decentralized autonomous organizations, for instance. And what I do believe is that in the metaverse, these decentralized autonomous organizations are actually going to be brought into life. This is because now you do not have a space where the people that are part of the decentralized autonomous organization can meet in a more engaging way, right? You can do a Zoom call, of course, if you would, if your autonomous organization would, and if the people there would like to show kind of like who they are, right? Because in the Web3, you also have the privacy part. But in a metaverse, what would happen is that you could create your avatar and you could work with the people, let's say, of the decentralized autonomous organization there, go on meetings and other stuff, right? Other items that people could be able to, own is art, wearables, and gifts. In terms of art, one of the arts is not only, let's say, the NFTs, like, for instance, how do you call it? The CryptoPunks, which is, I suppose, the most well-known collection, but art, not only art in terms of photography as well, right? If you're a photographer, you could create your photos and add them and how do you call it? Sell them as an NFT, and the person that actually bought the NFT would be able to put it on their house on the metaverse to be able to reflect, let's say, the photograph, or whether that is some sort of art, right? Other forms of art within the metaverse would also be, let's say, AI art, that is basically to use AI and deep learning to create your own and other tools, let's say, to create different forms of art, right? And also you would be able to buy gifts. One of the best examples that can come to my mind right now is, let's say you're working with a friend who is in Australia and you are located somewhere in Europe, let's say France, right? And you really like that friend, you know them, maybe you've also met physically, maybe they are your childhood friend, and you would like to buy them a small gift, right? Right now, you're not able to do that very seamlessly, right? But what could happen is, let's say if you would like to buy them what should I say, a dinner, for instance, right? It doesn't need to be very expensive. You would like to buy them a dinner. And there are, let's say, restaurants that have like chains of restaurants, right? You could say, let's take a very generic one, let's say Subway. I know it's not a very fancy restaurant, but maybe everyone can at least relate to and recognize the chain Subway, right? So let's say you would like to buy your friend in Australia a meal on in the Australian Subway. You're in France. So what you could do is Subway could create NFTs within the metaverse, which you could buy, send to your friend in Australia in their wallet, and then they could redeem this NFT for, let's say, for a meal in the, how do you call it? In the Subway in Australia, right? So because right now you would not be able to do this. I've tried it myself. You kind of have to take your euros, let's say, and convert them to Australian dollars and all of these kinds of things, right? But in a metaverse kind of way with NFTs, you would be able to do something like this as long as the company would also be in the metaverse as well. This is one possibility, of course, right? So we're also going to see a few use cases. For instance, like during the pandemic, I can also send these articles afterwards for you to read. One of them, let's say, I don't know how religious each person is, let's say. In the call, of course, we're coming from different places of the world with different experiences. But let's say during the pandemic, one of the problems that people had is they could not go en masse in a church because, of the social distancing. You were not able to see friends and everything. And the Decentraland, which is one of the metaverses that exist for the moment, what they basically did is they constructed a digital church, and people that wanted to go and pray together, they were able to log in there, speak with one another, with their friends, and be there digitally rather than physically, right? So this is one use case that you could basically see from a metaverse perspective, the fact that sometimes you're not able to be, for whatever reason, physically in something. I'm trying to make it really general as well, so that you can also kind of like think your own use cases, maybe from your own life, like whenever you are not able to be physically somewhere, you would be able to log in onto the metaverse and do it with other people. Let's say if that could be something like a community event, like going to a church where you share the same religious beliefs with someone. It could be an event that you would like to basically, how do you call it, attend. That could be also a concert, any kind of these events. Another one use case is, of course, here you kind of can see the Russia's Hermitage Museum had created a museum in the metaverse. This one, I think, was the Decentraland as well. I do not remember by heart, but basically, let's say you would like to go to a museum and see, let's say, their art exhibitions, right? So instead of going, let's say, to physically there, if you cannot, let's say you are in New York and you would like to go to Russia's Hermitage Museum, but because you're working or anything, you're not able to go there, you would be able to go there digitally. Of course, it's still not the same thing, at least for the moment, but it's still a nice way of going there with your avatar, as we see here, and see all the paintings that they have, and you can even buy them as NFTs, for instance, right? So that's another nice use case. Except for museums, you can also see other cultural centers. You could see, we're going to also hopefully manage to go to a museum in the metaverse at the end, of this on hands, let's say, session. But basically, as you can basically see, is you're recreating a digital world where you can basically be there and do stuff that you would do in a physical world, but with different trade-offs, right? So, of course, on the one hand, in this case, you have it's better to be probably physically there to see all the paintings with your own, let's say, eyes. But if you cannot make it for whatever reason due to your busy schedule, you can do it digitally. And of course, now the metaverse is in very early stages. So you just see an avatar here, but in the future, with better graphics, with better internet connection, with better, let's say, technology in general, you would be able to make it more and more realistic. Think of it a little bit like video games, right? I don't know if any of you have ever played video games, but if you look at the graphics of video games 20 years ago or even 10 years ago to today, you kind of see a gradual improvement in the graphics, right? So think of it perhaps in a similar way as well here, that as technology progresses, as the internet connection would become better, the graphics of it would be better. You would be able to do more things. You would be able to, at some point, perhaps also feel certain stuff as if you're really in there. Let's say you're with a friend in the metaverse, you're drinking a digital Coca-Cola, for instance. You would perhaps be able to use technology to kind of feel as if you're really drinking the Coca-Cola while you're basically really not drinking it, for instance, right? Another use case, and this is also true for my own university, is the fact that you can also study in the metaverse, have courses, university courses. You can have courses, from different other instructors. You do not necessarily need to, for it to be a university, but it can be a course that, let's take the university here as a good example, right? The university is in Tokyo, which is in Japan, and you're in New York. Again, let's take an example. So in order for you to go and actually attend this course, you would have to physically move to Tokyo, disrupt your life, your obligations and everything, and go to that university and learn whatever you would like to learn, right? In a metaverse way, you would still be able to stay in New York with your family, with your life and everything, and just enroll in the, in the course and be able to follow it through the metaverse instead, right? You kind of can see the lecturer there, the professor. They kind of can turn on the microphone or off. Well, as I said, it's early stages still, so it's we're not that immersive yet, of course, right? But you kind of can see that you can follow courses in a more engaging way, in a much more distributed or decentralized, of course, way. You can have people from all over the world going into this university course, no matter their background, and be able to learn. Another thing that you can basically do here with courses, but this can also apply to the previous use cases. For instance, in church, I would not really say that it would apply, but maybe in the museum it would apply, as well as the university course. So for instance, I'm also following my own course in the metaverse at my university. It is a very deep 12-week course. And in order to kind of enroll there, you have to mint an NFT. And with that NFT, you get access to the course, right? So if you do not have that NFT, you will not be able to follow the course. And the difference here is, let's say, I bought the NFT or I minted the NFT and I do not like the course anymore, but I know, for instance, Agama really loves the course. What I could do is take the NFT and sell it to her own wallet, so that she can basically follow the course instead of me. So in that case, you can also see that, NFTs can create, and the metaverse itself can create this convergence of digital life and and of physical life, where you can basically have people that you perhaps even not even met ever physically, going to class basically together, creating relationships perhaps together during, during breaks and anything. And this is how basically it works. And at the same time, you own the, how do you call it? The access to the course, which you can sell. In today's world, even in a physical world, if you buy something, let's say for a course, let's say even a university course, you probably are not able to sell it anymore to someone else if you do not like the course, right? Let's say it was overhyped. It doesn't need to necessarily be a university course. It can be just from a random instructor, right? It can be a yoga class or something. If you do not like the instructor, if you do not like the way that it is being given, you have the possibility in the metaverse to actually sell that token for someone else to come in your place, which is not most of the times possible in let's say the physical world. I would say it's like, from my experience, it's not possible at all. But of course, at the same time, you don't know what you do not know. So maybe there are courses out there where you can basically do that. But again, in that case, what happens is that you're physically bound to give it to someone who you personally physically know within, let's say, the same city, the same town that you're in. While in a metaverse scenario, again, you can have someone who is in Nigeria and someone in Norway, and someone in Nigeria does not like, let's say, the course anymore. They can sell that they can go on OpenSea, put that NFT, on sale, and someone in Norway who actually does like the course can buy it off of you, and you can make, the money that you lost. If you're a good negotiator or something, maybe, and if there is a really good marketing of the course, you could perhaps even make a profit. I don't know, in this kind of case, right? Another one is, again, JP Morgan here again as well. You kind of create, you recreate the life that you kind of have physically in a digital world. And there are some differences, right? For instance, in the metaverse, you're not bound by physics, right? So you kind of can give the people that are part of the metaverse different kind of experiences, whether that's, let's say, whether you're, let's say, a business, for instance, right? You depending on the metaverse, depending on how much control you have over the metaverse, we're going to go through that as well. You are able to give different kinds of experiences. For instance, here we kind of see the JP Morgan Onyx, how do you call it, office in the Decentraland metaverse, and you kind of can see here Tiger passing by. This is, of course, still early stages, so this is one way that you kind of can give a different feel, a different experience to people in the metaverse than in a real life, where you would be able to give, well, you have physics, and probably if a tiger would see you, no matter where, they would probably eat you, right? So this is one way that you could do this. You can basically make it so that there is no law of, how do you call it, of gravity, perhaps, and you can think of new ways of communicating messages, creating new experiences, for instance, any kinds of these ways, right? Another thing that you can also see as a use case, a potential use case, is learning history, right? In a potential, let's say, future where, as we said, the technology has reached its kind of peak, and you kind of can see very well, let's say, the metaverse world, you could perhaps, instead of being in a classroom, you could learn about ancient Greece, you can learn about ancient China, about the, let's say, ancient African civilizations, native American civilizations, and so far, constructed by historians in the metaverse. Let's say a historic metaverse. You could kind of, let's take ancient Greece, right? You kind of call it ancient Greece metaverse. There's not very good branding, but just for learning purposes. And you kind of basically can go to ancient Athens in that case and see how people lived and experience it, instead of actually learning it just from a book. I'm not saying that books would go obsolete, of course, in that case, right? books are very important always, but this would be an add-on experience of how people could learn as well, right? Then another thing that you could do with the metaverse is, let's say you really love a book, right? Let's say you like The Miserables from Victor Hugo. You could, let's say a more popular one would be maybe Game of Thrones, The Lord of the Rings, or something like this, like as a book, instead of, watching perhaps a movie. You could go into the metaverse and feel as if you're one of the soldiers of Gondor, for instance, right? And you kind of see it immersively, how all of these things were happening in the book instead of reading it or watching the movies or the TV series as we basically do today. Another one use case is, you can create video game metaverses, and this is called play to earn. This means that each metaverse has its own economy or mini economies, depending on how you would basically construct it. Maybe each community within the metaverse has their own token, depending on how the metaverse is created. Or you can also have a token just, for just the entire, how do you call it? Metaverse. So let's say in terms of play to earn games, this basically means that players are able to earn financial value in terms of, playing a blockchain game. There are two kind of categories of this. It's, let's say, free to play, where players can play for free, but most of the times when players play for free, they normally have to kind of advance in certain levels of the game before they can actually earn money. Or pay to play, which is a bit like, I put Skyrim here and The Witcher, like to video games. You kind of, normally what you do with a video game, if you would like to play it on Xbox or PS4 or PS5 or whatever, you normally buy, well, now you don't necessarily need to do it anymore, but of course, in the past, you were buying the CD of it, right? And you could put it on your PlayStation or your Xbox, and it would play. Now, what you're doing in a pay-to-play video game is you're buying an NFT, which could represent a digital CD kind of thing of it, which would allow you to kind of get access to the game, right? So that's another way kind of you can basically look at it. And the way that players normally get, let's say, to earn money, it's basically you produce game items that can be animals, that can be creatures, potions, or anything, depending on whatever game you are. You kind of create this as an NFT, and you sell it to another player for the token of, let's say, well, of the metaverse game, right? Now, the difference here, of course, is that you already have that more or less in a normal video game, right? You can create something, especially in MMORPGs, you can create something and sell it to someone for in-game currency, right? The difference here is that you're selling it for a cryptocurrency, which you can then convert to fiat money, dollars or euros, and they use that to buy something in the physical world. So do you see here again how it converges with digital and physical in some ways, right? Where of course a video game is not real, but now you kind of do something in a video game which you could sell to someone and take that money, convert it into fiat currency, and buy something in your local country currency, and then you kind of think of it: is it really real or is it not? Because you kind of converges and you cannot say for sure is it real or not anymore, right? A few other examples, let's say in terms of metaverse, video games, it's Axie Infinity and CryptoKitties. They are a bit similar to one another. What you're doing is you're breeding creatures and kitties, let's say cats in this case, and other players can buy them off of you for cryptocurrency, Ether, or any other cryptocurrency, depending on the video game currency, let's say, and you can take that then and convert it to fiat currencies, and then of course You have also, for instance, Alien Worlds. So that's another video game where you, instead of having, let's say, kitties or animals or creatures, you have trading. It's a trading card game, and you can sell and buy cards in a very similar way that you would perhaps do that as a child by playing Yu-Gi-Oh card games, Pokemon card games, but in a digital world where you would be able to play with all people across the world. And at the same time, you could perhaps theoretically make the video game a DAO where people themselves can vote and propose changes to the game, right? Instead of having a CEO of the game, let's say, no video game comes to mind, right? But let's say take Facebook, for instance, right? You have Mark Zuckerberg, who kind of gives sort of like the orders of how things should be. And in a video game, you have the video game company that updates the video game if there are bugs, if there are differences, let's say. In such a case, it would be the players themselves being able to vote and propose different improvements to the game, let's say. So this is another, well, these are some other use cases, of course. And here I created a very, well, it's not a very sophisticated one, let's say, because it's still very early. And at the same time, you can also see this from the video games here. You only have card games, and you have, how do you call it? Animals being traded. But now think of it, let's say, as I said, Witcher 3, which is a really big studio, or Skyrim, which is a Bethesda, which is also a very respectable video game studio, using these NFTs to create their own video game economies, let's say, right? So that's another way of kind of like seeing it. We're still very early in the stages, so we kind of have very, very basic video games. But if you fast forward in 5 to 10 years, you would be able to see these kinds of games being far more sophisticated as well. And now, especially, you have very big problems with the in-game economy, right? Because you have to create the economy in such a way that it is sustainable, right? So that no one can somehow cheat and get more money from someone else, or find a bug and get money, basically, right? So it's still in its early stages, but here you can see some examples and use cases, of course, as well. In terms of metaverse, right, you can have an open metaverse, as I said, and a closed one. This means that, you know, you can have something like a gated one. In this case, let's say buying something which some people will not be able to perhaps afford to buy, and so it's not open in terms of people, of being inclusive in some ways. And then you would be able to have open metaverses like the OM that I hope we would have enough time to visit. It's basic. If not, I'm going to give you the links, and you kind of can explore it yourself afterwards. But here you can see that if the metaverse is not interoperable with other metaverses, this would mean that they're not as open. By interoperable, I mean, let's say I'm in metaverse A, I have ownership of digital assets. Let's say I have my house, I have my land, I have my clothes or whatever within my avatar. Can I take my possessions and go to metaverse 2 and still use them? That's what interoperability would mean, basically, right? In terms of ownership of digital assets, again, can people own their digital assets? The more you say yes, the more open it becomes. The less you say no, the less open and inclusive, of course, it becomes as well, right? So if you own digital assets, what kind of digital assets could you own? Can you own everything? Can you own just simple, let's say, cards? If it is, can you own a house? Can you own land? How much can you, let's say, own in terms of assets, right? Then you have multiple governance models. This means that you can have a centralized one, let's say, well, Mark Zuckerberg is a really good example of that, right? So as I have understood, his metaverse would be a centralized one where he would be the CEO or the god of it, and he would be able to govern it as he sees fit. In OM metaverse, let's say, you do not have perhaps per se a governance model. You would perhaps not need it. In another metaverse, you would be able to have a DAO as a metaverse, let's say, where people would decide. You can maybe have a hybrid where you kind of have the CEO, let's say Mark Zuckerberg in this case, as we already mentioned him, and you could have a DAO where certain let's say decisions are being taken by the DAO, some of the CEO. It could be like 50-50. Maybe the CEO can have more decision power, since the metaverse would be his, let's say, than the DAO, or the DAO would have more voting power than the CEO. It depends on how you would basically create a governance model from the metaverse, right? And also different graphics to operate in different connection speeds, because as I said, we're not still, and we're not going to get there very, in a very, let's say, how do you call it? In very soon, like where everyone has equal access to speed of the internet, right? And there are different variables for that. That can be also that you're in the middle of nowhere and someone is in the city. Most of the times, if you're in the city, you have a better connection than someone who is living in a village, right? So in that case, if you have slower internet, the metaverse should be able to lower the graphics so that you can still participate in it, right? If the metaverse is not able to lower automatically its graphics, depending, first of all, on your system, of course, on your laptop in this case for the moment, let's say, and at the same time your internet connection, then it's only available for those who actually have a really good connection, and other people would be left outside, right? So there you kind of can see also trade-offs here, right? If it is better graphics, you can create better hubs, better clothes. If you're a, let's say, person that would in the fashion industry and you would like to create clothes, let's say, it's better for you to have better graphics, of course, because you can work much better than this. But then in that case, you would leave people outside, not being able to participate, right? In an open metaverse, you would not have the freedom, let's say, to create as detailed clothes, let's say, for people to buy. I'm just giving an example, right? But people would be able to still participate. And then also from a revenue perspective, depends, if there are more people, perhaps you would be able to increase your revenue. But if it is like a smaller number of people, perhaps you can increase the price depending on on your business model, of course, as well, right? So there is also another framework that there is basically here, right? Like photorealism, sort of like how realistic, is the metaverse world as opposed to a real world. So you kind of, you can, as I said, you can defy the laws of physics, but at the same time, you have to still be somewhat realistic. It's a bit like a writer, I do not remember, it was a science fiction writer or a fantasy writer. I think it was George R.R. Martin. He kind of said, in a fantasy world, when you write a book, you do not have any limitations as to what you can do. You can have unicorns, you can have spaceships at the same time, you can have everything, right? But as long as the world is not realistic for the people, where you can create like relationships with one another, or you can kind of make it as realistic as you can in terms of plot, in terms of how people interact with one another, then no one is going to read your book. And in such a way, it would be also with the metaverse. No one would use a metaverse that does not feel in any way realistic, right? How immersive it is in terms of immersiveness. Let's say, do you need to use a VR headset to, how do you call it? To immerse yourself in that metaverse, or do you have to just, use, let's say, your laptop, for instance, right? Persistence in terms of, that's basically kind of how much, let's say, work, let's say, a person needs to do in terms of being able to participate in the metaverse. Let's say if your hardware is not, how do you call it, up to date, or if your internet, as I said, is not quick enough, then maybe like you have to be much more persistent in terms of joining that metaverse, in terms of work, let's say, in some ways, perhaps, right? Governance criteria like data ownership, can users own their assets such as avatars, land, and others that we kind of said. Can they take them to other metaverses, like an interoperability that we already said? Openness to developers, is it open for developers to create their own stuff and sell it? For instance, in a meta kind of company like with Zuckerberg, maybe it's only the developers of Meta that can create new work, new buildings, new graphic designs in any way, and then they can sell it. Or if it is open for any developer, like a DeFi in some ways, right? In DeFi, as long as you kind of have an idea and you know how to code, you can create your own protocol, let's say, right? In a similar kind of way, that is it open for all developers to participate and work with their ideas, or is it just centralized for the business itself to work on it, right? Censorship resistance, is everyone welcome? Can people be kicked out for their political views, restrict their experiences in some ways, perhaps even completely ban them, right? And I have Meta here as an example, for instance, where, like, let's say Facebook, of course, which is one of the products of Meta, they can basically do that, right? So in their metaverse, theoretically speaking, if they do not change anything, that would be still the case for all of these things, right? And DAO, is the metaverse a DAO? Used and owned by its users who can propose and vote on changes? Is it used by Meta, again, a centralized company, or any other, let's say, company, or if it is a mix of them or any other kind of governance mechanism? So I think we went through this, right? Yes. Okay, so I'm over. So now we can go to the metaverse, but before that, are there any questions? And let me check also what the time is. We still have 15 minutes. I'm not sure if we will be able to visit the metaverse, but I'm going to give you the link so that you can visit them themselves. Any questions on it? Let's see the questions here that we have, right? Marie asks, what about ethics in the metaverse? This can be the wild, wild west. Yes, that's a good question. Like, as you know, the industry is so nascent, there is nothing created that you can create your own ideas and write them somewhere, let's say on a blog, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Substack, anywhere that you're basically using, right? So you kind of participate, add your own ideas, build something. It depends on, on your ethics, of course, as well. One of the ethics would be perhaps with different religions. How do you align it so that everyone is respectful of each other's beliefs, and at the same time you do not ban them at the same time if they're not, like, how do you incentivize someone to be respectful of each other's beliefs without having to ban them because they said something bad, right? So this is a problem, I suppose, that could be imminent in a decentralized world, right? That I don't have an answer to that, but it's just an idea that came up, that sprung to my mind with your question. I don't know if that answers your question. And then any other, does anyone else have any other questions? Fabian asks, games are for entertainment. Where is the fun in play to earn models? Aren't these games also the windows for the metaverse? That's a good question, right? Because if you create a video game, you have to kind of balance it out, I suppose, right? Like if you create a video game, now your criticism is valid because most of the games, like I suppose most of the people would not play the games play to earn that we have now unless they could not earn money from it, right? So they are not as entertaining as some AAA titles, like, as I said, Witcher, what else? Skyrim, all of these FIFA, or depending on whatever you like in terms of video games, right? But you kind of have to also give it time for big studios like this to take, let's say, to adopt the technology, to play with it, see what they can do. And as the technology matures, more and more fun and play to earn would go together, right? For the moment, it's very nascent, as I said, so people are experimenting with them, and you can see games where it's fun to play, but you do not really earn much, or you can earn a living perhaps in some ways. Maybe not a living, but you kind of can get a more respectable amount of money, but it's not as fun to play, right? So people are still experimenting with all these things, and you also do not have very big players in the space that have the experience to balance these out in different ways. Any other questions? How will regulations work into Metaverse considering different geographies, countries? Well, Raul, that's a really good question, right? So that's a really good question. I have no answer to that, especially, right? My only thought is if it is a centralized metaverse, like with Meta, right? It's far easier because then you have Zuckerberg that you can, as a regulator, you can take him and tell him, hey, this is how you're going to do it, like with Facebook, for instance, right? Facebook, like, let's say, takes your data, for instance. Meta, like the metaverse of, let's say, of Zuckerberg might actually also take your data. In an open metaverse, you would not be able to, you would not have to perhaps sell your data and these kinds of things, right? So in centralized, it's much more easier to regulate because you have a person that is kind of like the god in some ways of the world. So you can take them and tell them, hey, you're not allowed to do this and this and this. But in a decentralized metaverse where you have people from all around the world proposing and taking decisions and voting, I have no good answer to that, right? Because as you said, it's very different jurisdictions, different people. Most of the times you also don't know who proposes, who the people are, from which jurisdiction they are. They can say they're from Russia or whatever, but in reality, they can be in New York or anything, right? I'm just giving ideas that come to my mind. So centralized, it's easier because you have one person, you have a team that you can, regulate and tell them what is allowed and what is not. In a decentralized one, it's much more difficult to do so. Ganesh has a question. Let me see if I can unmute you. I asked you to be unmuted, and maybe you can ask your question.
Yeah, in case of PUBG, there were a lot of suicide cases all over the world. Many were there in India as well. So government could take a decision and ban it in the particular country. In case of metaverse games, if something becomes a detrimental, who will be responsible for that if no regulators can take any action on it?
Well, one way that you could perhaps do that is creating universal regulation for decentralized metaverses, let's say, or video games, where you have universal police going to people's homes. But I'm not a fan of that as well, because, it's well, it can get out of hand really quickly, right? In theory as well. So I don't have a good answer to that. Like, in terms of how would you do that, you could perhaps, what you could do is ask the developers themselves to not being allowed to do certain stuff, but at the same time, you're not, if you're, let's say, in how do you call it, in Germany, and Germany says, you're not allowed to create this house, and Belgium, which is like, on the same like very close to Germany, maybe you can go to Belgium and create it, right? Like, it's very, very difficult to see how that would be regulated, of course, as well. What you could do is regulate the NFTs in some ways, perhaps, and go through the marketplaces where, I think the NFT marketplaces sooner or later will have to add KYC, and then you would perhaps be able, as how do you call it, as a regulator to see who plays by the rules or not. That's perhaps a one way that you could regulate it. But other than that, I do not see another but by the rules of the country that they're in, right? But other than that, I do not see any other way that they could be perhaps regulated. If the person does not go on, how do you call it, on NFT marketplaces that require KYC, then you would perhaps not be able to do that either, right? But the person could perhaps be, in theory, a criminal for that in whatever country they are in, but you still would perhaps not be able to very well pinpoint who they basically are, or very difficult to do so. I hope that answers the question.
Some extent, thank you.
We still have 5 minutes. Raul, wait, could we unmute Raul? He also has a question, I see. I asked you to be unmuted, so could you ask the question that you have?
Yeah, so am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
So this whole creation of Metaverse and obviously the development and the maintenance which has to happen of the Metaverse created, right? Will it not be too expensive to at the end if there is no ROI, or how do we meet the economies of scale, right, at the end? Will it take a longer time? And I mean, how do you see that it will work out that way? In terms of ROI and profits.
Could you please repeat the question, because you were not audible, at least for me, for half of it. So I'm not sure what you asked.
I have typed in the question also in the chat, which says Metaverse creation and its development or maintenance. Will it not be very expensive? How it will meet the economies of scale?
That's a good question. So what you could do here is, in terms of scaling it, right? You can create a hybrid model of decentralization and centralization, because I think right now, especially, blockchains and decentralized generally technology, also IPFS and everything, they're not developed to the level where you perhaps could have total decentralization besides Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin is the one exception that is 100% decentralized. So perhaps you could create, Metaverse on Bitcoin would perhaps not be very possible, because, you kind of have script, which is a language that is not as developed as in Ethereum, perhaps, or on Polkadot, of course, right? But what you could do in order for it to scale, at least in the short term, you could perhaps create a mix of decentralization and centralization in terms of files, right? Where you kind of can have these files being stored either, as I said, on IPFS. You could have Arweave. These are like blockchain decentralized off-chain solutions to store your data. You can also have how do you call it, Filecoin, that's like in terms of decentralization, right? But I think what would be the solution for the moment, at least, is like a mix of decentralization and centralization in terms of scale. And the thing is, right now, it's an nascent industry, so there is not much to do anyway in the metaverse right now, right? So it's not like very day-to-day thing, like you go on Facebook perhaps, or on your LinkedIn, or on your Twitter, and you kind of check it at least once a day, perhaps. I'm just giving an example, right? So let's see how it will develop, let's say, right? But I would say a mix of decentralization, centralization for the moment, and waiting for people to actually get to learn about the metaverse and what you can basically do in it, and the adoption to increase itself. Does that answer the question? Okay, wonderful. I gave in the chat 2 links. This is on the OM Metaverse, where you can connect your MetaMask wallet and kind of see it. Unfortunately, we do not have enough time for me to go through it. It's very, how do you call it? It's very fun. And the last link that I want to give is this one. I hope you would be able to somehow, figure it figure it a bit out. On cyber is basically where you can create your own house within the metaverse of OM, right? Let's say, right? You kind of connect your MetaMask wallet, and you can either buy a house or create your own for free, let's say, and you can decorate it with your NFTs. You can have your friends get in there and have a business meeting. You can even, I like one of the things that I did was I had a business meeting in the metaverse. Like, you know, it's still not as good perhaps as having how do you call it, Zoom, but it was a nice experience to see how it basically works, because in the metaverse you're not able to share your screen or something, but it's a nice for a conversation, generally speaking. So we're at 5 o'clock, so I think we're more or less done for today. Maybe Agama has anything to add. Thank you so much for everyone for coming. I hope you learned something today. And yeah, that's more or less it from me.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was a great session. I believe everyone learned something new from the session. And just to encourage us all to watch this video again if we need to, and also ensure that we go through the quiz and the study group assignment for the week, so you can actually apply for your weekly module certificate, because you need all 6 of them to be eligible for the final personalized certificate. And so we wish everyone a very great weekend and see you again next week. Bye.
Goodbye.